Hello and welcome to yet another program in our IPSA seminar series. IPSA stands for the International Peace College South Africa, and I'm the principal, Sheikh Ihsaan Taliep. As we've indicated in our previous program, we identify those pertinent issues, those topical issues within the community here in Cape Town, in South Africa and internationally, and how those issues obviously find interpretation, understanding, analysis, etc. We have the honor and the privilege of once again having in the studio with us an expert in this particular field, in the field of the philosophy of Islamic law, the Maqasid al-Sharia, more commonly known as the purposes or the higher objectives of the Sharia. It gives me great pleasure to once again welcome Dr. Jasir Auda. Dr. Jasir, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's great to be here again, Sheikh Ihsaan.
Dr. Jasir, the last time when we were talking about the phenomenon of the Caliphate, the establishment of the Caliphate, we were talking about this phenomenon of the emergence of ISIS. How, of course, in the Muslim world in particular, more from the mainstream religious bodies, etc., responses have come forth guiding the Muslim community, also establishing for the international community the position of mainstream Islam, the middle road position, which is obviously synonymous with mainstream Islam, against this formation or this call for the establishment of a caliphate. At the same time, also looking at some of the horrendous and really most challenging kind of imagery that have been, of course, projected internationally, beamed across the globe, of how a so-called Islamic State conducts its business and its affairs. And so there's no room for any kind of dispute, any kind of disagreement. Whoever stands up in disagreement of this so-called state, of course, they face imminent death or anything as severe. So I think also we've taken the responsibility also to not look as isolatedly as it is to this phenomenon, without also considering some of the contextual issues, causes even, that may have given rise to this movement or phenomenon in the Muslim world. I think that was for us exceptionally important, especially also to ensure that in the media there is this voice of reason, this voice of rationality that comes through in the analysis and making sense of this particular phenomenon in the Muslim community. We've also, I think, given some reflection in terms of even the political, more particularly the geopolitical complexities that play themselves out in that part of the world, and how it really exacerbates these phenomena, these socio-political, educational, and those various levels, obviously, of the functioning of society. And I think the last point, Dr. Jasir, that we made was how religion is sometimes used and conflated into the agendas of political entities to achieve certain outcomes. Dr. Jasir, maybe just some reflection on how the exploitation of religion also find itself unfolding within this particular conflict.
Yeah, it's true that religion, especially Islam, is exploited sometimes in this debate. It's exploited by ISIS, ISIL, Daesh in their claim to be an Islamic state, and it is exploited by some people who would love to separate Islam from daily life, from Muslims' lives, and then they say that Islam has nothing to do with politics. Islam has a lot to do with politics, but not in the Daesh way, and not in the apologetic for tyranny and dictatorship way. Islam has a lot to do with politics in making it ethical, in making the political decision an ethical decision for the best interest of the people. Siyasa, as we define it in Islam, in a branch of Islamic knowledge that's called the Siyasa Shar'iyya, or Islamic political theory. السياسة لمصلحة الناس، القيام على الأمر بما يصلحه, which is, السياسة is for the best interest of the people. And that is how Islam defines siyasa, defines politics. So some people misuse Islam in order to justify their un-Islamic and non-Islamic behavior and they just give it an Islamic attire, but it is not Islamic. And that is at the middle path between people who really misuse Islam, and on the other extreme, people who would like to separate Islam totally from public life, and that is impossible in Muslim societies and communities.
But Jasser, I think very fundamental principle here also is we're kind of looking at religious sectarianism that play itself out. There's the political sectarianism, obviously, that also coming into play. And when one considers some of the very foundational texts in the Holy Quran, it really brings this phenomenon also to mind in creating awareness, alertness, and a sense of sophistication in the mind of Muslims and society in general. When in the Holy Quran we hear Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna Fir'auna ala fil ard wa ja'ala ahlaha shi'a, that in the reference to a tyrant and a despot in history, in this instance here, Fir'aun or the Pharaoh, this was a methodology that he used, and in the Holy Quran it holds that he arrogated and he elevated himself above people, and he divided them into different sects. يُعَذِّبُ طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ. In fact, he would then, certain sects from among them, he would severely, of course, chastise and punish them. And we know the story about Pharaoh and the children of Israel, Bani Israel, etc., etc. And so those principles of divide and rule, those principles of, creating sectarianism on the ground in order to just exacerbate the confusion, obviously, that prevail. And so this consideration or concern really of sectarianism from a religious perspective conflicted with political perspectives is really one of the main challenges, I think, in our area.
It is, and subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put so many stories in the Quran, not for entertainment. Stories in the Quran are for us to learn the lessons of history and to learn how societies function, and they are selected from the long history of humanity by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and put in the Quran, especially the story of Pharaoh and Musa and Harun and the children of Israel. It takes almost half of the Quran in size, in absolute details, and so many aspects of it, so that we learn from it. Allah put it in the Quran because it is the strategy of tyrants in all times. Every era has a different kind of tyranny, like the pharaonic tyranny, that would like to divide and conquer, rule people by dividing them into sects. And that is very important when we deal with different, you call them sects or firaq or madhahib. I prefer to call them madhahib, or schools of thought or law in Islam. Schools of law in Islam is one topic, and politicizing the schools of law is a different topic. I mean, there is a difference in Islam between Sunni and Shia differences and Saudi Arabia and Iran differences. These are different things. Saudi Arabia and Iran is the politics of the time, and the politics of the time has their dynamics and there has their issues, but we should not equate Iran with Shiism, and we should not equate Saudi Arabia with Sunnism. No. These are countries that have regimes that have their own political interests and political conflicts and political agendas, and we as an ummah are wider than that. As an ummah, Sunnis and Shia lived together as communities in Iraq, in Eastern Arabia, in India, all the time, in Lebanon. Different schools and different paths to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are correct and are all Islamic. Everybody who believes in Allah and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and prays as we pray and fast Ramadan is a Muslim. And yes, of course, in every school of law there are deviations. There are deviations in the Ja'fari madhab. There are things that the scholars of the ummah, the rest of the scholars, said were wrong. And there are deviations in every madhab too. And there are people who misused the school of law for a dunya purpose or a worldly purpose, and sometimes a wrong understanding or something that is mythical that found its way into some of the fiqh of that school or that other school. It's all correct, but we should differentiate between communities and the politics of dictatorships, communities as Muslims, we should live in unity and in harmony. We should correct each other, that is correct. We should say that defaming the companions of the anhum, for example, is wrong. I have a number of Shia friends who do not defame the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and they think that this is unacceptable. I am aware of a number of fatwas, the latest fatwa by Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, for example, that forbade the defamation of the companions on the Shia of his followers. He's a marji', like a reference. Yes. And we should encourage that. We should encourage the voices that is trying to come to a common ground. And we should say that what is wrong is wrong. It is wrong to defame any of the companions. It is wrong to bring into the aqidah of Islam anything that does not belong to it. The aqidah is Allah is one, Muhammad and the messengers and the book, and so on. We could differ on some of the actions of the companions of the anhum. A companion is not a prophet. A companion could be right or could be wrong. So yes, we could differ on some of the issues, but we should not fall into the hole of takfir, of calling each other kafir or disbeliever, and we should say wrong to what is wrong anyway. But we should keep our higher interests as an ummah, and especially outside that region. And in that region there are political issues and geopolitical fault lines there that are very deep. And it is unacceptable what Iran is doing in Iraq, for example. As an Arab Muslim, I can see that there is a lot of injustice that Iran has done in Iraq and in Syria. It's unacceptable to get into that. It's unacceptable to convert people to a madhab from their original madhab, not from outside Islam, to make them Sunnis or to make them Shia. All of this is unacceptable. No. We should leave people with their madhabs that they choose for themselves, that they are born with, dominant in their communities. But the Arab world is on one hand, and Muslims in South Africa, for example, is a different story. In the UK where I live, or in Canada where I also live, we should not divide ourselves as Muslim minorities outside the Arab world over these issues, because we have higher objectives, we have higher purposes. We should remain united as Muslims, and we should not fall into mirroring the problems in the Muslim world that started with defamation and so on and ended up with arms and killing people just over their names. People in Iraq now change their names in different areas, because if your name is Omar and you're in certain areas of Baghdad, this is the wrong name, people will shoot you. And if your name is Mahdi in a different area, people will shoot you. And this is very sad. Yes. We don't want to import that to South Africa. That would be very bad. And we don't want to import this to Europe or to Asia, where Muslims have been living in peace for centuries. Why do we disturb that?
Yes. I think, Dr. Jassir, also we again, just reflecting on the Graham Fuller reference we made in the previous program, where there are certain, of course, international agendas that seek to gain its foothold in terms of whether it's natural resources, in terms of course, establishing states within the Middle East, establishing also the authority of certain regimes as clientele regimes within the region, etc., etc. And I think it is of utmost import that as communities, it must be borne in mind that this strategy of divide and rule will always be exercised. It will be used as a method against a people, and to ensure that foreign invasion, if you wish, into a community becomes effective. And so it becomes so more imperative for us to be cognizant of this. And as you've said, I mean, God forbid, but this is a fait accompli in large swaths of the Arab world, in the Muslim world. This is a fait accompli. As you said, notwithstanding that, for example, in Iraq, people have lived together and intermarried, and there was no distinction as to who is Sunni and who is Shi'i until the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and there are documented and documentary evidences in terms of how the strategy was used to ignite the fires of sectarianism. So this is obviously very dangerous.
ISIL itself started in the prison of Abu Ghraib, where their Caliph, whatever the guy who calls himself Caliph, was imprisoned for years. There, that's when he started that. He started it in Abu Ghraib under torture and under also the discrimination between Sunni and Shia when the foreign occupation came and elevated the Shia to the presidency of the country and divided the Sunni majority into what's called Arab Sunnis and Kurd Sunnis, and therefore make them minorities, and then arrest some of the youth there and torturing them in prison, and ironically allowing them in prison to form a group, which I don't know how it happened, but then they formed the group in the prison there. When they went out, they went to Syria and then joined by other generals from the previous regime of Saddam, who are now the major generals in ISIS, and some others from. So there is, it never ends as well. The division never ends. Now they started by killing Shia, and then they now are killing Sunni, whom they consider apostates, and now they are divided. The latest news is that ISIL itself is killing some of its followers from the followers of one of their judges who defected from the court because he did not think that their court is serving justice. Now they are killing them for apostasy as well. So it's a fire that's killing itself.
Yes.
And we don't want to import this to our societies. We should keep the moderate view of Islam that what is wrong, but we should not call people disbelievers who pray like Muslims and read the Quran. This is haram, this is one of the biggest haram, to call a Muslim a kafir, and he is Muslim. But we should call what is wrong, wrong. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran said, لَقَدْ كَفَرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْمَسِيحُ ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ. He said, people who call a man God are people who are disbelievers. Then we should call what is wrong, wrong. But we should not divide our communities along these lines. We should look for common grounds. And mentioning maqasid al-sharia, or the purposes of Islamic jurisprudence, this is common ground from my studies of the different madhabs in Islam, Sunni, Shia, Ibadi, Zaydi. All of them refer to the same maqasid, to the same purposes. The preservation of faith, the preservation of life, the preservation of family or offspring, preservation of intellect or mind, the preservation of wealth, justice, the fitra, the natural inclination of human beings. And all of this is a common ground between us. So we as Muslims should come together and should work together towards issues of justice, towards maintaining the welfare of the family in our communities, the welfare of the young men and women in our communities, rather than divide ourselves over a foreign issue that is not our issue.
I think, Dr. Jasser, the point that you perhaps focus on for us is education will never stop and should never stop. So we should always put forward the views which we believe are the correct views. We should always call towards that which is correct, but it should be within the framework of education. They have to be educational processes, and it's only through education that the minds can be liberated and the minds can be elevated and edified. As opposed to, I think, your references there to, declaring people out of the fold of Islam. This is unfortunately a mentality that has set itself and that has taken root also within communities. It's that what, of course, even in the mainstream media, these terms are now almost becoming commonplace. Takfirist and takfiri mentalities and attitudes, which obviously is indicative of a mentality that no sooner does somebody disagree with them, then the immediate recourse is to put that person out of the fold of the religion. And obviously this is the takfirist kind of mentality which becomes divisive, which becomes sort of fuel to the fire of sectarianism.
It is because of lack of knowledge. The problem is lack of knowledge. The more knowledgeable the Muslim will be, the more tolerant a Muslim is, the more merciful and the more educated the Muslim is, the more he or she is able to cooperate with others within Islam and outside Islam. for the common good of humanity. But our problem is an educational problem.
Yeah.
We don't have Islamic education that is middle path, middle way, that is popular enough in order to make the critical mass in the Arab world and the Islamic world at large, so that we have a critical mass of educated Muslims in Islam and in Islamic studies in a way that builds societies rather than destroying them. And that is part of the reason I really appreciate what IPSA is doing, Islamic Peace College of South Africa here in Cape Town and South Africa in general, trying to educate Muslims at a certain level of Islam. Undergraduate education that you have now is at a basic level. Now you're thinking of more programs at a higher level. This is very good news for Islam and Muslims, because the more highly educated Muslims you have and the higher level of understanding of Islam you have, the more peaceful societies we will have. There is an absolute link between education and peace. And the more peaceful societies you have, and hence your name as a Peace College. I like that for a name of an Islamic institution.
Thank you, Dr. Jasser. Dr. Jasser, talking about peace and talking about the purposes of an Islamic state, etc., and then comparing it obviously to what we view in the context of an ISIS, and really obviously being able to make the really just a finding that it is a complete juxtaposition. If we imagine that a state is a space of a people, a citizenship, a community, we obviously the prosperity of society, the advancement of society, the success of civil society, its structures, its organs, the establishment of civilization. Obviously all of that can only but flourish and reach its developmental objectives within a setting of security, within a setting of peace, dignity, and obviously for all its citizens. I think in our discussions, obviously, we have been focusing then on this whole notion of an Islamic state. And I think in our next program, we'll come into the meat of really what it means to kind of, attach the description of an Islamic state, and when a state is Islamic, or when a state is actually, or a state just to start with.
Yeah.
And so I think before we get there, Dr. Jasser, maybe if we could just look at, from the sort of more jurisprudential perspectives, and as a professor in philosophy of Islamic law, what are some of those sort of classical definitions of Caliphate, Khilafat, and what are some of those foundational texts that we find either in the two sources, being the Quran, the Word of God as taken by Muslims, as well as the prophetic traditions?
Yeah. Well, the word Khilafah is mentioned in the Quran, that in the first chapter in Surah Al-Baqarah, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is appointing a Khalifa, a human on earth is a Khalifa for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In English would be a
vicegerent.
A vicegerent,
yes.
After Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the sense of i'mar al-ard, in the sense of civilization. So Khilafah is equivalent to civilization in Islam. And when we had an Islamic Khilafah, it was an Islamic civilization. It was not a modern state in the sense of borders and sovereignty.
Correct.
And our borders were open to anybody who comes and lives in the Islamic civilization and contributes, Muslim or non-Muslim, to the Islamic civilization. The Khilafah is a place that defines security and peace, defines the achievement of the best interests of the people. Khilafah is how you can achieve that. It is not a violent ideology. And we had two phases of Khilafah, roughly, in Islam. A phase of Al-Khilafah Al-Rashida, the guided Khilafah. After the Prophet ﷺ, we had vicegerents to the Prophet ﷺ in the capacity of being a leader, ﷺ, Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali. And in this age, we had a Khalifa and a whole system of governors under him, made out of the companions, pious people. They are not after their worldly affairs, they are after serving, and they were examples of public service, as we call them today, at the highest levels. They were examples of being very keen with public money and public funds.
Yes.
At that time it was called Malullah, the money of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Malullah was Malul Ummah, really, the money of the people. And so they were dealing with this in a very careful way because it was a trust. So the Khalifa was a person who was entrusted. And the Khalifa in that age was a servant of the people. He was at the service of the people, employed by the people rather than self-appointed. And therefore, the Khalifas did not want to take any money from the public money at the beginning, but Umar radiallahu anhu said, no, the Khalifa has to have an allowance, a small allowance, for him to be able to continue. After that age, we started to have a very different understanding of Khilafah that perhaps is repeating itself now in many ways. Absolutely. Which was a diversion from the true essence of Khilafah.
Dr. Jasir, unfortunately for this program, we'll have to stop on that very high note. It is paving the way for our next program to go more into the details and the meat of the concept of Al-Khilafah, the Caliphate, from the jurisprudential perspective of Islamic philosophy and Islamic law, inshallah. Until we meet again, thank you very much for being on our program, Dr. Jasir. And to our viewers, we thank you once again for joining us in this edition of the International Peace College South Africa IPSA Seminar Series. Until we meet you at the next time, good day, good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.